There we go. All right. All right. Thanks again for being here. So it is Community Data Watch Friday and it's October. How did that happen? Our topic today is on community nonprofit organizations in Halton. So this is data that we've been waiting for a little bit. Hasn't been released since 2018. So a bit of an update. So we'll go through all of that. But before we get started, of course, we would like to start with a land acknowledgement and acknowledging that Halton is rich in the history and modern traditions of Indigenous people. Halton is on traditional lands in the Mississauga of the Credit, part of the Anishinaabe Nation, that extends from the Niagara Peninsula across Hamilton, Halton, and Toronto to the Rouge River Valley. We thank the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations for sharing their traditional territory with us. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous people on this land. And obviously we hopefully we took time to pause this week on Tuesday to think about the children in particular that were taken. And I was able to participate in Grandmother's Voices walk at Bronte Creek. It was very powerful. I must say, I'm grateful for the opportunity for the thing that they pulled together. At one point, there must have been 200 people standing in a circle, and it was very moving. They had actually all the children who had come into the middle. And we all sang a song together that they taught us. It was very powerful. And it was a traditional song that it was called Wildflowers. And it was a signal to the children to go and hide because the government man was coming. And so very, very powerful moment. And to actually have these wee ones in our midst. And Jody reminded us, what a hole it left in communities when those children were gone. It was very, very powerful. If I can hold it together, I'm going to read you a poem I shared with people in the past. This time last year, I was actually in Tofino, and I was there during Truth and Reconciliation, and I picked up this book of poetry that was written by students in that community. So I'm going to read one. Blank slate, ready to be filled with beautiful color and mystical lines placed carefully, methodically. But now color has become dim, lines jagged, scribbling recklessly, carelessly. I try to erase what's been left behind. You can't erase what's been deeply inscribed. And we can't and we shouldn't erase that. But we were reminded on Tuesday that we remember for the children from the past, and we think and remember for the children going forward. So as much as we cannot erase the past, it's important. We should never do that. We should think on that and make sure that that doesn't happen going forward. And so, yeah, just my thoughts. And again, a great gratitude to Grandmother's Voice. And I think Rock also, who organized that this week. So Community Development Halton, in case you're not familiar with us, really quick hit, just so you know who we are. Some of our teammates are here. We are connecting communities, what we do. We like to say that, and we do it in a couple different ways. One is through Volunteer Halton. We are the volunteer center for the region, and we have workshop series and an annual congress, which I'll plug later. We do advocacy, we celebrate volunteers, and we have, of course, a portal. And here's a QR code that takes you right there. It's called Volunteer Connector, and it is chock full of opportunities for people to be involved in community as volunteers, to get involved civically in our community to help make Halton the best it can be. We also pay attention to important numbers. I quickly changed this morning. I had an old slide. I'm like, shoot, the numbers went up. And so some of the kind of numbers that we pay attention to are the ones we're going to share today, but also just Halton's growing poverty. Halton's poverty rate has gone up based on 2023 tax filer data. So a specific data set that we're able to provide in between census is at 13.1%. Milton has climbed to 15.6, Oakville 15.2, Burlington staying at 9.9, and Halton Hills at 9.5. I share that because it's important to pay attention to that, and we hope to connect you, our community, to important information like this so that we can do something about it. These numbers are relevant for the nonprofit sector today. So we do that through our social planning work, and we are involved in all sorts of things around some primary data collection and community and belonging. We do workshop. We have podcasts based on the community data watches, and we have lots of reports and opportunities to get involved. We have National Housing Day is coming up on November 21st. We would like to just take this moment to thank United Way of Halton and Hamilton for their financial support, as well as the regional municipality of Halton. We would not be able to do our work in social planning without our very generous funders. So many gratitudes, and I think some of you are in the room today that support us on that journey, and we thank you. Also to our community, we have a research advisory committee, and some of you are in the room as well. Provide guidance and lots of good conversation throughout the year. Thank you. And last but definitely not least, all of the documents that we produce actually are reviewed by peers in our community. People just graciously take the time to look at the material in advance, and they are yeah, it's an invaluable in this process that we go through, so that it's, provides some rigor to the work that you see in front of you. So thank you to those who took the time to review this. Again, some of you are in the room today. So what data are we looking at today? So again, I mentioned that StatsCan has released some new data. It's from 2019 to 2024, and it's the Canadian Business Count. So we're going to talk about that. Has some limitations, but it helps us understand what's happening in the sector. And we also are going to look at a little bit of the 2024 ONN State of the Sector data. There is new data coming later this month, but it's not there yet. And also some change maker well-being index just came out recently, and that's through Imagine Canada. And it is national data, but it felt really relevant for this conversation. All right, so I'm just gonna move you all over here. So we wanted to have a deeper understanding of the community nonprofit sector. It's essential for understanding local needs, fostering collaboration among stakeholders, allocating funds, resources more effectively, and supporting workforce well-being and informing policies that tackle systemic inequities in our community. So, that's, for example, the poverty data that I just shared. Our local nonprofit sector is impacted by policy and programs at all levels of government, and it's critical that we understand the value of our nonprofit sector for the health and well-being of our community, and the importance of the sector's voice as local decision makers and elected officials navigate turbulent times for our community. We are certainly living in some turbulent times. So understanding the scope and the nature of the community's nonprofit organization, Halton, requires kind of a complex navigation of some landscape of classifications, which I'm going to try and explain. Richard's on the call, and he can jump in when I need help, I'm sure. Data systems and definitions. So there's no single source that captures the entire sector. So we're kind of, I don't know if we're unique, but it certainly it puts us in a bit of a pickle sometimes when we think about how do we understand and share the data for the sector. I think, which is just an advocacy point just as on its own. So it includes everything from registered charities and social service agencies to volunteer grassroots initiatives in our community network. So we have to try and figure out how do we share all of that large continuum of how we describe the nonprofit sector. So to do that, what we have to work with is something called the North American Industry Classification System. StatsCan relies on a combination of industry codes and organizational structure data, and many nonprofit community organizations fall into two community groupings. So there's 624 group, and it has social assistance services, child and youth services, services for the elderly, and then there's another group that is around social assistance services. So it's just this is just to show you that it's a little bit complex and things are grouped together, and it makes it sometimes a bit of a tricky landscape to navigate. So, and we're going to refer back to those classifications in a bit. So describing the sector's impact, we know that Canadian nonprofits employ 2.5 million people, so it's Canadian, makes the sector the largest employer in Canada. Anybody feeling surprised by that? I think lots of people are. 70% larger than construction, 60% larger than manufacturing, and 20% larger than retail trade. Wow. So pretty interesting. The charitable and nonprofit sector contributes an average of 8.1% of the total Canadian GDP. In Ontario, the contribution is 7.9% of the province's GDP, surpassing construction, energy, and agriculture. These are pretty impressive numbers, I think, and we've it's contextualized as our sector's impact. When we're doing the peer review process, one of our smart folks out there said, "That's great. What are the Halton numbers? We don't know." So I'll just be honest with you. I'm coming clean. We don't have that. What is the collective and what is the actual impact? So it's good to know numbers, and on the GDP is really interesting and important. But part of the concern that we have is just like what data exists and what narratives could be shared. And so that's a work in progress for us here in Halton. And I think, perfectly flagged by one of our folks. But yeah, a question we have. So where are our nonprofits? So this is based on the Canada Business Counts and that classification piece that I shared earlier. You can see figure 1 here. This is Halton. So this is Halton data. And we can see that over between the 2 years, or that stretch 2019 to 2024, the total number of nonprofits has declined from 1,021 in 2019 to 904 in 2021. You can see where they land in terms of Oakville is the blue line, the green is Burlington, Milton is this kind of purplish color, and then the teal at the bottom is Halton Hills. So with Oakville having the largest, and then Burlington followed by Milton, and then Halton Hills. Population wise, that seems about, when you think about what how does that work, I think we might all have some insights into why they are where they are. Oakville remains stable, and other municipalities saw declines during that 2019 to 2024 perspective, and a lot of that happened during COVID. If you just to go back and look at where some of those dips were, and not all of our nonprofits recovered after COVID. So some did and others didn't. Richard, of course, has provided us with a map so that we can, sometimes it's easier to, at least for me, visually understand something with a map. And so curious to know if there's anything that strikes people. Is there any brave soul on the call who wants to share looking at the map and looking at where the largest proportion of our nonprofits are finding themselves in the region? Any insights around that distribution? I have a few thoughts, but I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. Alicia, love to always count on you. Yeah, it's awesome.
I always got thoughts. I always got something to say.
That's good.
It would be interesting to overlay other demographic data with this, like concentration of poverty, maybe age group data. That would be interesting to see.
Very interesting.
Correlations there.
Yes, fascinating. Really interesting idea. I'm sure Richard's taking notes. That is look, if we're able to do that, watch for our blog page and we'll update there. That is really interesting. Interesting thought. For me, this is the home base for these organizations is going to be in those communities. And we know that a lot of our organizations serve the entire region. So you look at, Halton Hills obviously has, a smaller population to serve as well, but also some of our organizations might be based in Oakville or Burlington, but are serving those communities as well. So that's a really important thing to remember. Anybody else want to share something? Yes, Alicia again.
On the location note, I'm curious if this is like main head offices because we know agencies like Art House are located in like multiple
Yeah,
community hubs. So is this reflecting that as well? Like it's hard to maybe see
it
the
is.
community spread.
Absolutely. So yes, Don, he's on the call. He's everywhere. Absolutely. Yeah, he's not going to be, his dot's probably not showing up in Halton Hills. It's going to show up in Oakville for sure. Yeah. I think Sarah and then Fatima.
Just tying into that, it just always strikes me that so many of the nonprofits are kind of along that transit corridor in Oakville
Mm,
and Burlington. And, from Milton's perspective, we always hear from people that it's so hard to travel between Milton, and I'm sure it's the same for Halton Hills, down to when some of those services are. So just keeping in mind exactly what you were talking about, Alicia, right? Like how can we get those services in our communities
yeah.
if they're not already there? Just keeping in mind so many vulnerable people, the transit is an issue.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. Transit always factors into every conversation we have. Thank you for that, Sarah. I think also, just to that point, and then I'll go to Fatima, like just the idea of how to find affordable rental space. How can we work collaboratively to create those? Because just even finding rental space for an event is like pulling teeth sometimes in the community, let alone affordable space to touch down. So, but super point. Fatima.
Hi, Risha.
Hi, good
Um,
to see you
I
again.
just kind of, based on what Alicia's comment was about like dividing between demographics, just speaking
Yeah.
from like the newcomer perspective, these
Mm,
trends actually align with permanent resident arrival rates.
mm,
So Oakville has like the most newcomer influx, or the total number of newcomers from like 2024, 2025, followed by Burlington, then Milton, then Halton Hills. So I think that's really, I don't know if it's correlation or coincidence, but it's interesting that it follows the same trend. And also another point is Milton has the highest rate of newcomers arriving. So from the
mm.
last 10 years, it's also the fastest growing region for newcomers. So I wonder, because the data I think you showed was for the last few years, and I wonder if we look at like within the last 10 years, maybe it's grown a lot faster and it might be continuing to do so in the future.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Fatima. Great questions. Yeah, what Richard always reminds me is usually data just makes us more curious and a map makes us ask questions. So, Richard, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think this is just a very generalized map because as you've seen earlier, we do have classification of those
Yeah.
the organization by type of work they provide. So we can actually map like for each of these particular type of organizations and then superimpose on like poverty or something or immigrants. I think that will give us a more granular look in terms
Yeah.
of the distribution of organization uh, 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 in to the particular population group. I mean, you can look at least like maybe another 10 maps, each one
Mhm.
into another level of details.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You've got us all, yeah, thinking about what else we could do with this data. At some point, you have to stop writing on these papers because it gets to be like it's already at probably 30 minutes and we don't know when we'll read it. So these are great follow-up posts possibly that we could lean into. Thank you for that. That's amazing. I'm going to keep moving just to get to the next bit. We can see that in figure 3, we've got about 2/3 of community nonprofit organizations in Halton fall into 3 of the main categories: childcare services, grant making, and giving services, and other individual and family services. So that last category is a little bit broad. But yeah, really childcare services, quite large, grant making and giving services makes me super curious. They're not necessarily, I think to be clear, when I started to dig into that one, like they're not just all, there's not 171 grant making services necessarily just giving funds to Halton. So for those of you who are quickly looking for money, they might be serving other places, but as well, in addition to, but kind of interesting. And then other individual and family services, quite a large category. Civic and social organizations, not too far behind. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, just in terms of those categories. Could probably spend all day just digging through every single one of these things. But in comparing the 2019 and the 2024, it becomes interesting again. And we can see that there's been, so the teal color is the latest number at 2024, and the darker color is the 2019. So we can see that there has been a decline in childcare services, and actually a little bit of growth in grant making services and other individual and family services, and civic and social organizations saw growth from up to 12% in terms of these again, these are in these categories, these business counts again. Yeah, so any questions or insights that you have in terms of the decline or the increase in those particular categories? Anybody want to have a go at that? Or any insights? When we were writing the paper, some of the things that I was thinking about were the increase in like caremongering organizations and just those social care people just taking care of neighbors and moving from a very grassroots group, which we're going to talk about, to becoming a formal nonprofit through that process. They spent a number of years really caring for their neighbors, and then they formalized that by 2024, which I think was interesting, where I was able to sort of research a few examples of that that might show for a little bit of an increase in one sector. Alicia.
Yeah, this is a little bit like surprising to me. I'm wondering like if wherever this data kind of like came from, did they have to pick like one category? Because we know so many nonprofits and charities are like multi-service. Like when I think of like Rock, I'm not even sure which one it would fit under.
They go, right. Yes. I think, yeah, I think you can only pick one. Richard, am I correct in saying that?
Yes and no.
Okay. I love that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think that's why there's so many challenges in terms of collecting data. It looks nice when we see a chart like that, but when you go back how the data were put together, like that can be very clear when they decide how to put that particular organization in one of the category. Like Lisa mentioned earlier, like that someone can provide food bank services, that immigration services, and whatever. So depending how they kind of provide the type of services, Statistics Canada and they say they try their best to put them into one category. So I think that's one of the things we have to keep in mind when we look at that. These are the challenges they face when you cannot, I mean, whether you want to include everything, then you probably end up with maybe 200 categories rather than to something like 13. So that definitely is that challenge there. And I know they always try to improve on it, but still that's what we get, what they have.
Thanks, Richard. Great question, Alicia. And you're going to see one of our recommendations around how do we build our local capacity to share data in the nonprofit sector so we can really share the impact. I'm going to keep moving, just looking at the time. So you can just see here in terms of the changes, proportion of organizations by category, municipality, and how it's almost like a mini heat. It's like a heat map, but in a chart in terms of proportion by municipality. So you can see those childcare services is like hits the number. It reflects up the other chart, and with lots in Milton, which makes sense given it's our youngest population from municipally speaking. So I'll let you look at the report and have a bit of a further look. So this is just looking at labor force. StatsCan business counts provide some insight by classifying community nonprofit organizations. We're just saying there's some limitations here in 2024. Again, 1,162 community nonprofits established under those categories. Of those, 63% reported operating without employees. You might be like, oh my goodness, were they all run by volunteers? Well, this suggests a high level of reliance on volunteers. It's important to interpret some caution. So our business count data can be misleading when it comes to volunteerism. Organizations listed without employees aren't always volunteer run. So they could be sole proprietors, self-employed operators, businesses in contract, people that contract out work so that they're not listed as an FTE. I know lots of our nonprofits don't, like, even executive directors who are on contract. Having paid employees doesn't indicate a lack of volunteer involvement as well. Many nonprofits with paid staff rely heavily on volunteers, so the opposite. And the business counts are an unreliable measure of volunteer workforce size and impact. So that's a whole piece of work. And when we think about decent work, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but also decent volunteerism. When does volunteerism cross the line between volunteer work and paid employment? Interesting question, or yes, curious to put that out there for you. There's a significant discrepancy between different data sources. So we know that business counts show data based on these classifications of 37% of Halton nonprofits have paid staff. ONN's 2024 survey indicates that 86% of nonprofits have paid employees. Huge discrepancy. Different kinds of methodology and the types of organizations. So data is something, but it's also something we need to sometimes be cautious about. And it's really important that we be having conversations. We might, just what might be our recommendations and how we can act locally to improve how we communicate about our sector, who's employed, how many people are employed, how volunteers are engaged. I think this is a really important conversation for us to be having in our nonprofit sector to be able to tell the story to our funders, to our local decision makers, and in particular to community as well. I'm going to keep moving so we have time for some other conversation. Funding and nonprofit sustainability. This is going to not be a surprise for the most of you, but despite available funding, many nonprofits in Halton face challenges. So we do have some very generous local funders. We have Halton Community Investment Fund. There's United Way. We have 3 different foundations, that are very public facing, and many others, as you saw in the business counts, and lots of great support. Many people have access to Ontario Trillium Foundation grants as well. But despite all of that, there are still short-term grants, funding restrictions, intense competition for resources, and it creates uncertainty for many organizations. And when we gather up, folks, qualitative data for you from meeting with our nonprofit sector, this is like the #1 issue that comes up, is unsustainable funding. $5,000 to change the world, and how do you move forward, and how do you plan, and how can you really pay people well and sustain your workforce? So decent work and living wage is another section in the report. Decent work. One of our reviewers asked, what does that even mean, decent work? And so decent, this is from ONN's Decent Work Project. There are a variety of definitions that we actually give you a bit more in the paper, but here's one. It means more than fair wages and benefits. It reflects a cultural shift that builds on the values that drive our work and drive your work in community. Decent workplaces are fair, stable, productive workplaces. It means building a culture of equity and inclusion at work and ensuring everyone's voices are valued and heard. Decent work means acknowledging the highly gendered nature of the nonprofit sector's workforce and developing solutions that address women's particular interests and concerns. And that's again from ONN, from Ontario Nonprofit Network. And there were some really interesting pieces that you'll find in there from the childcare sector as well, have done some work in decent work. But wage is part of it as well. And so we know that the minimum wage just went up 40 cents, I think yesterday or the day before, which is good, but not enough. And a living wage is the hourly wage of a worker that they need to earn and cover the basic expenses and participate in community. And that's from the Ontario Living Wage Network. Currently, that number sits at $26 an hour in Halton. We'll have an update for that in November when that number comes out. So just touching briefly on nonprofits in uncertain times from the paper. So we know this is, trying to find data on this is hard. We keep looking on tariffs and how it impacts us, but we have to sort of, just continually do some reading. But we know from reading some work from the Center for Policy Alternatives, just the tariffs and economic uncertainty definitely will impact the nonprofit sector. And here's how some of that will. We've got us just giving, we read also, sorry, I'm just going to jump over to austerity measures from one of their reports. We look at, as we spend more on defense spending, they're starting to use those words austerity. And we know that there are cuts in certain segments of the nonprofit sector. For example, our settlement services. So Fatima and all the hard work that's happening and Maribel, with our Halton newcomer strategy and our settlement friends like HMC connections, lots of ISARC dollars have been cut, and we're seeing the impact of that already with the impact on like no childcare services for our link classes, for English classes. And so that's providing barriers to people to being able to access services. Other things like Service Canada cuts, where people are going to be spending more time and trying to get answers on things, longer time to hear back about grants, all of that. So those are some of the suggested austerity measure issues that will happen in the nonprofit sector, something for us to be scanning for and looking for on an ongoing basis. We know that giving is up based on Canada Helps, their giving report for 2025, but by a declining number of givers. So there's actually, it sort of speaks to that, the 1% are able to give more, which is lovely, but there's less number of us who are able to give. So how does that play out in terms of strategy for trying to find funds? It becomes concentrated for donors. So this is not necessarily through granting necessarily, but just donations given in community. And I think that's a real struggle for our community, is trying to seek out those kind of donations. We are seeing increasing community need, and that is just beginning here. I'm, talking with folks from other places like down closer to Windsor, where people who have always had housing all of a sudden don't have housing, and people who never thought they would need help from manufacturing, auto part industry in particular. More is coming, and so we'll wait and see, crossing our fingers for the best, but not necessarily hoping or not expecting that. Constant need for planning and adapting. It's so in the nonprofit sector, when you don't know where your next funds are coming from, or that's going to end, and how will I replace it? And with declining, people that you can seek out for funds, the constant need for planning and adapting is tiring. It's hard to keep staff. And as you can see, I'm going to show some other data. It leads to burnout and other HR challenges. So just quickly looking at the Changemaker Wellbeing data that we had, again, from Imagine Canada, and it's called the Changemaker Wellbeing Index. This was the first really neat randomized panel survey that's been done in this work. And so it is national, but it captured the voices of over 1,000 nonprofit workers across Canada. And it is led by Imagine Canada and Common Good Strategy. So, and it shows that workers in community-based nonprofits are experiencing higher levels of stress, insecurity, and burnout compared to counterparts in other sectors. So you can see here that we've got it compares community nonprofits, the darker color, to in government nonprofits. Interesting. And so just to see how, the poor well-being for community nonprofits at 39% versus 32, job dissatisfaction at 23, low life satisfaction at 23, food insecurity at 34, because people in the nonprofit sector, community often are making much less. Burnout and exhaustion, both scoring high there, with a government coming up higher. Loneliness, anxiousness at work, and fair to poor mental health. So about a quarter. So that's, averaging in around 1 in every 4 people in the nonprofit sector are really struggling. They found some other particular vulnerable sectors. Social services, 45% report poor well-being with high rates of burnout, 39 and with poor mental health, exceeding the nonprofit average. Arts and culture and recreation, 49% report poor well-being, the highest rates of loneliness and job dissatisfaction. Really interesting. That I'm super curious about that. You would think, that's such a social kind of space. That's really interesting.
I am too.
Retention is another major concern. 20% of nonprofit workers say that they're likely to leave their job within 6 months. So there's that HR crisis. An additional 22% say it's possible, meaning over 40% of workers are at some degree of departure. So they're either planning on or thinking about leaving their roles. It's very high in social services, arts and culture, where over half of the workers are actively considering leaving or unsure of their future. 39% of women report poor well-being compared to 29% of men, highlighting a significant gap that would deserve a targeted attention, according to Imagine Canada. So moving along, we've got grassroots organizations. We didn't want to leave these folks out. This is a hard segment of the our nonprofit sector, our community-based sector that is doing incredible work that is really hard to quantify. Grassroots groups are small, community-led initiatives. This is a definition for you that emerge in response to local need, often outside of formal nonprofit or charitable systems. So they are not, you're not going to find them in the Charitable Business Registry Ontario or through the CRA. They're typically volunteer-driven, informally organized, and rooted in the lived experience and shared values of the communities that they serve. Some of the challenges, based on research that we've done, some of the literature shows that some challenges faced by grassroots organizations include need for some small-scale trust-based funds. So there's some interesting work that's done in other communities with like micro grants that help people along. Things like that have happened in Halton before, but I know Volunteer Toronto worked with a number of other organizations in Toronto to do some work like that recently. It was really successful. They just put out a report. Capacity building and administrative support. So just like, governments or how you run an organization and administrative support, like you need insurance, or you need a space, but you have no money to do that. Who can you partner with? Affordable digital space. Not everybody can afford a website. And people say, well, I don't know what they're doing. And we've done some story projects with grassroots groups, and people are like, I just wish people knew who we were. And they have a Facebook group, but they don't have, or a page, or they have Instagram, but they don't have a website to drive people to because they just can't afford that. It would be coming out of their own pocket. Need for formal recognition and inclusion in local planning and decision-making processes. So do we invite them to the table? And just greater visibility in local data systems because they're not included, whether they have the capacity to. So how do we come alongside of them to make sure that the incredible work that's happening in community organizations is actually represented as we tell the story about what's happening in community? So calls to action. I'm going to wrap here quick. There's lots. For funders, multi-year flexible funding, upholding community nonprofits over privatized services for best community outcomes, rethink local philanthropy so that community holdings are meaningfully invested in community action that supports financing of Halton-made projects for Halton residents. Obviously, there's more in the report that I haven't covered today to get to some of these things. Recognize that nonprofits are economic drivers, meaningful space at the table. So part of the decision-making process as we face turbulent times, we need our decision makers to include our very rich in impact nonprofit sector to hear what is actually happening on the ground. Ensure that grassroots and small nonprofits are recognized, included, and valued in regional planning. Support well-being initiatives for nonprofit staff and volunteers, including mental health supports, rest, and renewal programs. Invest in capacity building and leadership development for grassroots equity-seeking groups. prioritize collaborative systemic approaches that reduce competition and foster solidarity across the sector. And based on some, some of the suggestions today from Sarah, just like how do we make sure that we're represented well in all parts of the community, and how can we collaborate to make sure everyone has space to serve the folks in our communities. For the nonprofits, so for those of you from nonprofits here today, working collaboratively to advocate for the sector for decent pay, sustainable wages, and a seat at the table as decision makers plan for our community. They can't do it without us and community residents. Develop capacity in the areas of data collection and data storytelling. And then also for the community, for any citizens with us here today, learning about the impact of the nonprofit sector, please ask and speak up and join us as we have these conversations, and volunteer and share your time with us in community. So, whew, that was fast. We've got 15 minutes left, and we'd be amiss not to head into. I'm gonna stop our recording.